Hafa day, Dr. Gigi, and thank you for the very kind introduction on this very beautiful day of Valentine's Day. And one of the things the West does do right is the celebration of love. And so, in the context of our webinar today, I'll be speaking a little bit about love and Indigenous healing, a positive and cross-cultural psychology perspective. I do want to say just at the outset that I am not a licensed psychologist, although I do have an undergraduate degree in psychology. But as you can see, I certainly do behavioral health counseling in different settings and in different jurisdictions. Special greetings to our Magic Six, six of your faculty, including Dean Stan, who have visited Guahan late last year as part of our partnership between the University of Guam and Benguet State University, which we're very happy to embark on almost a decade now of information sharing, student exchanges, faculty exchanges, and just really learning to deepen our relationship with each other. And so as I get started, I'm not going to talk too much about love on the front end. My apologies in advance. But I did want to begin by talking about our connection as Indigenous peoples in the Mariana Islands, which are called the Chamorros, who are from the Mariana Island chain here. You can see the cursor that I'm circling here on this map. With the 𝐂𝐫𝐬𝐬𝐿 in the northern, as you all know, your homeland, in the northern parts of the Philippines. And so I know that most of you take that mandated class on history of the Indigenous peoples. And so you're probably familiar with the theory of migration into the Pacific, which is having originated in Taiwan, into the Philippines, and in our case, through Sulawesi Island in Indonesia, and then up into the Mariana Islands. And the most recent genetic testing evidenced this. And so for us, what this shows and means is that the Philippines really is our ancestral homeland in terms of migration. I myself am biracial, so I am Chamorro on my mother's side, but I'm also Filipino on my father's side, not from the Cordilleras, but from Pangasinan, the town of Bolinao. So this clearly shows how we're connected, but we're not only connected in terms of migration and our regional identity and practices, but we are also connected by a shared history in terms of colonization, in terms of the presence of the Spanish in their period of colonization, and that being then transferred through the Treaty of Peace or the Treaty of Paris to be wards of the United States. And the Philippines, for us in Guahan, are real champions because you're the only ones in the club of us that were given to the United States or purchased by the United States in the Treaty of Paris to become an independent country. So as neo-colonial as it may seem, it is a real victory in so many ways for the people. And so as part of that shared history, there's a number of different things. And this list here really is not exhaustive, but is reflective of our colonial experience here on Guahan, where as a U.S. territory, we continue to have colonization. We continue to remain on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories, of which there are only 17 of us left in the world. It is not a statistic or something that we are proud of. Similar to the Philippines, we experienced war occupation during World War II. We also have high levels of poverty and a high risk for it. And then there's another, the list is a different splattering of things, one of which is most significant for us as Indigenous peoples is land dispossession. And so after World War II, the United States, through the Department of Defense, surveyed the whole island of Guahan and took prime pieces of property for the construction of U.S. military bases, which continue to exist here on our island. And in that process, Indigenous peoples really experienced a very severe severing of the land, which as Pacific peoples is very central to our identity and to our being. We've had our language banned, lots of identity and role confusion that's happened with the introduction of Western values, the introduction of patriarchy, because traditionally for us, most of us in Micronesia, Asia, most, not all, but most, we are matrilineal, matricentric, and matrifocal. So women play a very critical role in society, in our indigenous society, as well as in our modern society, so much so that land is transmitted along the mother's line, and the woman oftentimes is credited for being the peacemakers and for being the decision makers in our context. But what I have highlighted here and what I want to focus on is the demonization of our traditional spirituality. And for those in psychology, spiritual psychology is one dimension, but for myself as a clinician of almost 30 years now that I've been doing clinical work, I've come to really center spirituality in terms of the healing process of the clients that I work with. So having this shared history of colonization and different traumatic experiences, it gives rise to a concept that Braveheart, based out of the United States in his work and in his identity himself as a Native American person, introduced the concept of historical trauma and defines it as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that occurs across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. And so as psychologists, as therapists, we focus largely on helping people to navigate the experience of trauma at an individual level. And oftentimes that's as a result of, in our case, war experience, right? A lot of PTSD from going to a war, as well as from the experience of violence, be it through physical abuse or sexual assault and sexual misconduct, the whole basket of those things. We also see it whenever there's accidents or natural disasters. But what we need to be cognizant of is that this doesn't occur just at the individual level, but it also occurs at a group communal level whenever trauma is collectively experienced. And so Evans Campbell gives us 3 criteria for historical trauma, and that includes that it was experienced by many people, there was high levels of stress that was generated as a result of the events, and that outsiders perpetuated or perpetrated the events with destructive intent. And so we see in the case of historical trauma that it impacts, while it may seem to impact just the larger community because it's individually experienced, the reality is it also impacts the individual and the family in those contexts as well. 𝐸𝐚, and just indulge me by going through the literature a bit here. 𝐸𝐚 from Canada, who does work with the Indigenous population in Canada, shares with us some very alarming statistics. A number of times of having visited the United Nations and deliver interventions, you'll hear interventions that are brought forth on behalf of Indigenous women and our safety collectively. And so 𝐸𝐚 shares statistics that the Indigenous women in Canada were twice as likely to experience intimate partner violence as compared to non-Indigenous women in the country, as well as were overrepresented in incarceration rates, with only representing 3% of the total population of Canada and manifesting 27% of incarcerated people during the time of their study, which was data that was looked at was between 2017 and 2018. Of those who were incarcerated, 50% reported experiences of family violence as children. And so we know in the literature, when we look at family violence or domestic violence, that there is absolutely an intergenerational component, and that unless there is effective intervention that's worked with a family, that oftentimes they are left to the devices of the tools that they learn in childhood, which was violence, in order to resolve conflict, which ironically enough is the source of conflict many times. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Canada were 12 times more likely to get killed or go missing as compared to other ethnic groups in the country. And this dynamic, this sort of assault of Indigenous women, you see in colonized peoples throughout the Pacific. And so this is also experienced by Maoris, as well as in the Maoris in Aotearoa in New Zealand, as well as Aboriginal Australians. And we can dare say that we have a similar kind of dispersed distribution in terms of these issues for Chamorro women here on Guahan as well. And so we are reminded by a local psychologist here on Guahan. She's now retired, but her name was Dr. Patricia Taimanglo Pierre, who in 1998 investigated intergenerational transmission of historical community trauma affecting Chamorros on Guam. And she actually interviewed different therapists in terms of their work with war survivors. And so it was very clear that this trauma is transmitted and is still very much present. And we see this perspective also echoed by Braveheart, who reported that the prevalence of high psychiatric disorders among American Indians and Alaska Natives living on the reservations, and that it was rooted in the experience of collective, communal, and generational trauma that manifests today. And it continues to manifest as racism, oppression, and discrimination. Those three words I know apply in general globally to Indigenous populations who are oftentimes stigmatized and ostracized for traditional ways and means. So when we look at the modern context then of Indigenous peoples and our experiences of historical trauma, that really warrants that for those of us that are in the healing profession, be it through counseling, psychology, or what have you, that we really need to consider the integration of culture-based approaches to be able to facilitate healing from that violence. And so I'm just going to cut away from my PowerPoint here real briefly. I just wanted to share a video clip that actually a friend of ours who was just in the Philippines with us, Ms. 𝐶𝐤𝐬𝐚 who's Maori from Aotearoa, had shared this with me. And I thought, oh, this is so appropriate. This is precisely the point of this webinar this afternoon. And so if you would just indulge me, we'll listen to this and then we'll talk about it in a sec.
Filipino culture does not always fit Western standards and ideals. I'll give you an example. A group of students took these exams in order to make sure that they were clear of mental health issues. But when these Filipino students took the test, a high percentage of them are scoring very high on the psychotic schizophrenia scale. Very high. So what did we find? It turned out that the Filipino students would always answer the questions as true. I talk to my dead relatives. I see ghosts. I see spirits. And then I said, oh my God, they always say true, 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 true. We'll never say false. In this culture, if you understand it, everybody almost automatically says yes. Yes to everything. They dare not say no because there is a sanction for no. And they think by doing that, they are pleasing the tester. So yes to everything. O, de patay ka. Your grades are down, you're schizophrenic. Can you imagine in psychology, the results for Filipinos? Either you're dumb, you're stupid, you're crazy. Really? So when I say Filipino psychology, it is supposed to be and must be culturally appropriate. And how do you do this? Know the culture. And how do you know the culture? Learn the language. And then you will open the doors to culture at its freshest form.
Okay, so a very nice brief reminder of the importance of incorporating culture. And I understand it, and please recognize, of course, that I'm on the outside looking in this observation. Let me just get this PowerPoint right back up. That video clip represented two dimensions to be considered in terms of the appropriateness of models that are used for working with our populations, right? So on the first level, what she's describing is that Filipinos generally say yes, 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 right? Not no, 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 but yes, 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 yes. And that's understandable in terms of the larger Filipino context, right? And you can see how that propensity could lead to misdiagnosing in terms of how scales are completed and assessment tools. But when you take it even further in terms of this video clip, which really is for me, what I find to be the most fascinating part is that the questions are, do you see ghosts? Right? Yes. Do you see spirits? Yes. Do you see the dead? Yes. Right? For Indigenous peoples, all three of those are very much really in so many ways a part of just the condition of living, right? This is our engagement with our ancestors, are the ghost, are the dead, right? And so you can see how if that is so central in terms of Indigenous practice, then it could become demonized. And as the woman's shared, that can be diagnosable, depending, of course, on which scales you use, and some of the symptomology of psychosis and of schizophrenia. Okay, so that really underscores the need then for us to shift towards more culturally responsive. She used the word awareness, but I wanted to share with you all the trajectory of cultural competency. And so awareness is sort of the first sort of building block of working with our client systems in the context of their cultures. And so with cultural awareness, this is where you begin to start to look at the beliefs and the attitudes of our client systems and what they bring into the session as part of their identity and who they are. So this is kind of the very beginning steps. This is the first steps, that building block in working towards cultural competency. And then as we deepen our competence in terms of meeting them from their cultural context, then we move into cultural sensitivity, where it's not just being aware of yourself and what separates you or what's different from you with your client systems and looking at beliefs and attitudes, but now you're starting to develop more of a cultural sensitivity. And with sensitivity, this is the focus on deepening the knowledge, right? And really understanding where is it that my client is coming from when they say that they see ghosts. Right? Does that mean they're psychotic, or is this a function of culture in terms of connection with their ancestors? And then deepening even further is the development of cultural competency. And in this case, and in the arena of social work, this is really centered to our practice, is the development of skills and in the use of intervention strategies by the therapist to be able to better meet our client systems where they are. One example that I often teach in the classroom here on Guahan, that's a very good example of this kind of misfit in contrast to the Western model of doing psychology. Western model, you sit across your client, you kind of lean in and you keep eye contact. Well, for us in Micronesia, direct eye contact for many of our peoples throughout the region, especially the more traditional communities, direct eye contact is a form of aggression. Right? So we need to be mindful of that. And from a Western judgment and lens, when you see somebody who's not keeping eye contact with you, it can be construed that they're not invested or they're not motivated in the treatment. But in actuality, it's a mechanism of showing respect and of avoiding confrontation and a deep sense of respect for you and the authority that you bring. So those kinds of practices need to be modified to be able to really meet our clients where they are in terms of their own norms, their own customs and beliefs and practices. And then as we move along the trajectory of cultural competency, we come to the bottom block, which really is the most progressive and it's sort of the gold standard of meeting our clients where they're at. And that's in the context of cultural proficiency. And this concept actually comes to us from the School of Education, the schools of ed, where they talk about the use of traditional practices as part of the therapy, right? And so, for example, in Hawaii, they have a conflict resolution process it's a prescribed process for Hawaiians that whenever there's conflict between different parties, you go through a process of ho'opono, which means preparing yourself to engage the discussion. And then when parties are both prepared, then they move into the process of ho'oponopono, which is a process that is prescribed that goes through explaining your position in terms of what had happened in an incident, taking responsibility, and ultimately forgiving and being able to reconcile and have peace in that process. And so in the case of cultural proficiencies, the employing of the process of ho'oponopono would be an example of cultural proficiency for working with our client systems. I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about an acculturation continuum. And so, as you can see on this slide, on the left, you have the more traditional, and on the right, you have the modern or Western context. It's really important for us to remember that when we meet with the client and we begin to engage them in the work, we need to reflect on where exactly is this client on this continuum. We can't make the assumption that they are modern, and we can't make the assumption that they're traditional if, for example, they just moved from the island. Because of Westernization, because of access to media, there can be people are at different points in this continuum. And so we need to take the time to be able to assess where are they at, and ask the questions to see, just because they're modern and living on Guam for the third generation of, say, a Chuukese male from Micronesia, we can't necessarily make the assumption that they're completely modern or Western, because in their family, they may have protected a lot of traditional practices and are certainly guided by those values. And so it's really critical that we assess our clients' level of acculturation so that we can meet them where they're at, so to speak, in the therapeutic relationship. And so moving along in this way of thinking then, and coupled with cultural competency, is also cultural humility, which means recognizing that we don't know everything when we work with our client systems. Even if we read about their culture, right? Recognizing that we don't know everything. And we always need to come in with that level of humility, largely so as in to not offend our client systems, and so that we're open to learning in that process. But there's this third concept, that, sort of the trilogy of these, cultural safety, that is defined as an environment that is spiritually, socially, emotionally, and physically safe for people, where cultural identity is recognized and valued through shared respect, meaning, knowledge, and the experience of learning together. So what the challenge is for us who work with client systems in this regard, with Indigenous populations, is to ensure not just cultural competency and humility, but cultural safety in the relationship and in the work environment and even in the physical spaces. Okay, and so now I'm starting to shift here to look at specific healing strategies for working with our client systems. And, if I have to link this to love, because I know Sir Stan's whole introduction was about love, and this is Valentine's. And, if I could flip my camera around, you'll see my dozen red roses that is right here. As Indigenous peoples, love is at the very center of how we treat each other. It's at the very center. And even if, and this is oftentimes the case for Indigenous peoples in traditional systems, the words, "I love you," even translated into our native languages, is very seldom uttered. Right? Because for us, it's about the expression of that love, the action of protection, of safety, of sharing, of giving, of helping to meet each other's needs that prescribes how we engage each other. So we really are masters in terms of relationships, right? Because, for example, in the Chamorro culture, one of my favorite values is called Fat Tau Tau. And with Fat Tau Tau, similar to the Tagalog language, Tau means man, right? So in our case, Tau Tau is human or humanity. And so Fat Tau Tau is the process of, I describe it as the deepest level and form of respect. So with Fat Tau Tau, you afford so much respect just by virtue of the fact that they are a member of humanity. So they don't need to command respect because they have money or they're rich or they're knowledgeable or they're intelligent or they're pretty or they're sexy or any of those things. It's just at the very baseline by virtue of the fact that they are a member of humanity. And so we must afford respect. Respect is an absolute manifestation of love. So if we look at healing strategies then, and so there's the work that we do with our client systems one-on-one in our therapies, but there also are strategies that are to be employed by agencies and larger systems that create that culture of safety and cultural safety in our work. And so some of these strategies include the employing and the use of culture-based curricula that is utilizing Indigenous ceremonies, languages, and traditions. And in the Philippines, of course, this is going to be your rituals. As well, focus on the total family system, employing the use of family group counseling and process, as opposed to just focusing on the individual. This is perhaps the most critical differentiation in the therapeutic realm between a Western approach, especially of psychology, to working with individuals and an indigenized approach. Right. And that is looking at the person in the context of their environment and including and incorporating into that healing process the entire family system, because we don't exist outside of our families in Indigenous systems. Right. We are merely an extension and a piece of a larger family system. And so in addition to that, we could utilize storytelling with our Manyina, which are our elders and our families. Storytelling in the Pacific is a very, very important and centered strategy in terms of teaching and learning. It's part of our traditional epistemology. And so it's for that reason that stories of the family and the experiences of ancestors and stories of our legends really, it's very strategic to include as part of being able to be illustrative with our client systems when it comes to lessons on life in particular. And we engage stories of the ancestors. Our ancestors are not to be feared. They're extensions and manifestations of us, right? And so recognizing that in a deep way and teaching a decolonized history. It's very hard to work with clients in the context, in a face-to-face context, if you're not going to bring that and contextualize it in experiences of trauma in history, like war experiences or the taking of land and so forth, because the whole concept of historical trauma is that trauma is transmitted intergenerationally, and unless you consciously release the energy of that trauma, then it tends to stay with family systems. And then, of course, the incorporation of spiritual practices to facilitate healing. It's been my experience as a therapist that it's really from the spirit realm that people are able to heal. And so that's why I've shifted a lot of my own personal focus to this approach. There are 4 quadrants in this graphic here: personnel whose identities reflect the demographic composition of clients is really important. And this is also related to language. As the Filipino woman said in the video snippet, speak the language, right? Because some would say that the indigenous language is the voice of the indigenous soul, right? So when you get to learn the language, then connection and engagement that happens on the front end of the working relationship really is facilitated in a much easier way. And then centering of ancestors as part of agency protocols as well. So if we look at this very, very simple religious framework, oftentimes, Tautau, this is people, this is us, oftentimes we're pitted that if we connect and align with our ancestors, which is our mañana, that it is in juxtaposition to a relationship with God or asaina, right? And so this can be very problematic for Indigenous peoples, almost as though the connection to our ancestors is demonic. And so one of our healers on our project that we're working on at the moment has shared this conceptual framework and model. Douglas 𝐂𝐫𝐬𝐷, who's in Hawaii, shared this with us last year, that really, when you've got humanity here as the people, your ancestors are your intermediary to God, as opposed to a juxtaposition or situated across from the divine. It doesn't preclude people from going and having a direct connection to God, but oftentimes that connection is really helpful in terms of a lot of the things that we need as humanity in our daily lives. Okay, and so I just wanted to share that really in so many ways, as Indigenous peoples, love is our currency, right? We're not motivated by the fanciest cars or, as Sir Stan said, yes, we live in the duality of the world with our Indigenous life and ways, as well as the modern context. But at our core, because our values are prescribed, those material things don't define who we are, right? What matters more is our relationships with others. What matters more is the importance of our human relationships. I've indicated here one of our core values in Chamorros, in our practice of Inafat Maulik. And Inafat Maulik refers to an interdependence among each other and with each other, and at all costs protecting collective peace. Right? So that you can see the decentering of the individual in that process and really recentering it on, as opposed to independence, recentering it on interdependence with each other in meeting the needs of our community. Hang on, I have to keep moving this Zoom box every time I have a different graphic, so bear with me. Okay, and so I wanted to share then some key principles of Indigenous healing that has, that has emerged from this research project that we're working on now. And one is the centrality of prayer, meditation, and really this would also include your rituals and ceremonies as part of connection to the divine, really, really critical, and usually is the first step. And what we've started to emerge as well, even from our visit to Benguet and to the Cordillera region, is that part of the prayer intention is largely in thanksgiving, right? Is gratefulness, which what the Western world of spirituality now is calling gratefulness and giving thanks. So that is emerged as something that's really central and important. As well, the ancestors as intermediaries to the divine and as helpers, if you will. And if you can imagine that we're an extension of them and they are an extension of us, you can understand why their presence really would be supportive and helpful in that context. Another thing is the care for the land is care for the people, synonymous. One relationship with the land, and the land is with us, and it is symbiotic, and there is no separation. The Maoris actually feel and believe in what's called the upstream, and this idea, this concept of the upstream is that when we as humanity neglect and not care for the land or allow for the land to be polluted, or in our case on Guahan, with massive militarization, then it will result in the land also not being able to take care of us. So this very symbiotic and direct relationship with the land is centered to our way of not just knowing and believing, but of healing in the person. So of course, the land is a very important instrument in terms of being able to heal the soul, right? And to heal the pain of trauma is to get your hands, get dirty, get in the dirt, some would say, and get in the land or in the ocean, in our case, of the Pacific. We see the role of women in peacemaking and in peace offerings. This is starting to emerge as well. And the very central part, and the last time I had presented on this, which was just about a week ago, there I've received a very visceral response to the idea of forgiveness. But really, this has been echoed over and over again, the centrality of forgiveness to be able to release and heal, particularly for us as Indigenous peoples. And so just to reiterate, some of these healing practices then manifest in ways of rituals, in chants, prayers, incantations, the use of traditional medicines, of massage, and traditional stories to teach lessons. In our case on Guahan, a lot of our stories are centered around legends that were told for generations that we use to teach very profound lessons, even though the legend itself seems very simple in its messaging.